Delighted to welcome David Fleming, he was telling me has been living here for about 3 years, but already got stuck into the local history, and he's going to tell us about this rogue, the Duke of Queensberry. So David, and afterwards we'll have Q&A.
Well, thank you very much, Simon. Thank you. Yes, indeed. Recently moved to Richmond, and I was intrigued when I first walked past this sign in Friars Lane, which some of you may have also seen. Formerly the palace, we know that, but here the house was built by a person who entertained here in grand style. So I was quite intrigued by that. Here he is. That's the 4th Duke of Queensberry, and this is the house that he took over in 1780. Who he, not he. This is the 8th Marquess of Queensberry, the boxing man. He's the man who introduced the Queensberry rules, or gave his name to them in 1867, so that people weren't so liable to be killed or injured in the ring, and the fight could go on for longer and be enjoyed for a longer. He was not so, talking of Queensberry rules, he was below the belt when he was the person who did for Oscar Wilde, who was having an affair with his son, Sir Alfred Douglas. But anyway, he's a distant relative. He was born 30 or 40 years after our man, the 4th Duke of Queensberry, passed away. So here he is. Just a couple of quotes about what he meant by entertaining in fine style. He says, one of the historians says, "The habits and morality of the Duke of Queensberry were entirely of the Epicurean school." Another, "One of the most outrageous gamblers and sybarites of his own or any other time." So, an interesting fellow. Forgotten now, really, apart from the plaque. He seems not to be written about any more in sort of diatribes or celebrations of rakes, but he was one of the most notorious, without any question. So this is the present Queensberry House, as a lot of you will know, won't fall over, built in 1933, 1934. Here we see where it is. It's around here, underneath the palace remains. More specifically, the greens up there, that's Ted Lasso land, and here's the river. This, of course, is the palace. We all, I'm sure, know the history of it. If we don't, I can recommend Mark Lucas's excellent book on Richmond Palace. My story really starts where Mark's ends. Here we see the palace. Oh, I beg your pardon, that's the wrong button. Here is essentially where Queensberry House now is. Again, the river at the top, green down the bottom. So the Privy Orchard, that's essentially where Queensberry House is, and where indeed the house always was. What preceded it was also there. This is a map from around 1707. This is really complicated how it got to become what was called then Cholmondeley House. It's like a sort of Georgian monopoly of just buying and selling, a sort of frenzy. Cholmondeley, Brigadier Cholmondeley, he'd been a cavalry commander in the Battle of the Boyne, and he, in payback for that, was made steward of the Manor of Richmond and given a lease for this ground, for the whole of this area, which had been the palace. The palace had been left in ruins during the Commonwealth, and it was too expensive, really, for Charles II to restore. So it just went to rack and ruin. People just made off with all the different bits of rubble. It says here, they were raised, severed, and enjoyed by several persons. So it was really in a mess. It starts to come together again in around 1700. As we see, Cholmondeley has this bit. Confusingly, he swapped some of his land with a guy called Richard Hill, who was described as a politician and diplomat. In fact, his sister, Mrs. Masham, was the second favourite of Queen Anne after the Duchess of Marlborough had fallen out with her. They swapped some land, so Cholmondeley ends up with this bit, which is Maids of Honour now, Queensberry House as is, and this rather useful passageway to the river. His And very importantly, have a look at this. This is what's called Friars. It goes all the way to what is now Askill House, and it goes down the river. So that comes into his story quite a bit. So that's quite important. Cholmondeley also buys a bit of the other palace around the gatehouse and the wardrobe. Cholmondeley Walk, Cholmondeley or Cholmondeley? Featherstone Hall or Fanshawe? I'm going to call it Cholmondeley. Here is the third Earl of Cholmondeley. His father, the Brigadier, inherited his brother died and he became the second Earl. In 1733, this guy, another George Cholmondeley, became the third Earl, and he was the man who really started doing the building. Horace Walpole, our neighbour in Strawberry Hill, I'm afraid, thought that the third Earl of Cholmondeley was a bit of a numpty. And he would know because he thought he was over-promoted way beyond his abilities. Walpole's sister Mary was married to George, the third Earl, and so the third Earl's father was Sir Robert Walpole. And as they used to say in Hollywood, the son-in-law also rises. So he was really promoted above his ability, but he did build. Let's give him that. He inherits in 33, and he starts to build quite soon after. This is probably late 30s. The map is 1742, but that is a library. There's the Thames. He builds a library first of all, and he continues through the 1740s building. He and indeed his father before him had sort of encroached on bits of the friars, the land, the wasteland by the river. They'd sort of encroached on that on some houses that had been built on the gardens. They bought or took those, and also on Friars Lane they spread out. But he basically started building. And then, as Walpole had perhaps predicted, he gets into pretty serious financial trouble, and he sells the Maids of Honour part, which on Richmond Green, and he also sells the bits that were on the gatehouse and wardrobe. So what he's left with is this, which is, so there you are, a Mrs. Eleanor Wood. So this here is the Queensberry House grounds as they became from around this is 1750 odd, and that's how they stayed. There's still a walk at the moment. This was passed on to an Earl Brooke, who became Earl of Warwick. An Earl Spencer also took it over, but essentially that's it. And we see here in more detail the grounds. Now, here we are, Cholmondeley Walk, and again you see this is a sort of classic view. This is, I assume, late 18th century, but it could be early 19th, and it's the view we all know. There's that building, of course, is there now. So that was that. Here it is today, same thing, and it becomes Queensberry Villa in 1780. The Duke of Queensberry becomes the fourth Duke of Queensberry in 1778. So let's have a look at him. He was born in Peebles in Queensberry House in December 1725. This is a picture by John Opie, the artist, and I'm kind of fond of this because it just gives you instantly how sinister this guy could be. He really doesn't look like he's actually turned out to be quite a very friendly fellow, but I think Opie saw something in him there. What he didn't see was that he shouldn't be holding a book. He said later in life that he found books utterly useless. He never read anything in a book that was of any value whatsoever. Certainly he came from the Douglas family who were involved in the Scottish Crown from the 12th century onwards. The first Earl of Queensberry, 1633, then he became a Duke, 1684. And then in 1702, the first Duke became involved, the second Duke, became involved in promoting the active union with England and Wales. And this went down quite badly amongst many Scots. There were riots. And so the Queensberrys essentially, while they kept Queensberry House in Edinburgh, they upped sticks really and promoted themselves mostly in London from there on in. This is the third Duke, who became Duke in 1711. He married a very interesting person. This is Kitty Hyde, or as it became, obviously, the Duchess of Queensberry. Kitty Hyde was a noted beauty, a really feisty character. She was a very, very important sponsor of John Gay and indeed the Beggar's Opera. Without her, it's quite possible it would not have been staged, and unfortunately we have no time to follow her, but a very, very interesting character. This is her, the third Duke under two sons. Now, Queensberry himself now is, at the moment, he's still not Queensberry, of course. His father, the second Earl of March, dies when our man is 6, and then he becomes the third Earl of March. Now, his mother sends him to live down in Wiltshire with this family, the Duke and Duchess, obviously with a view to promoting his career, although those two are ahead of him in the queue to become the next Duke. So at the age of 6, he's sent away, he goes to school, he goes to Winchester, which was popular with Scottish aristocrats, and these guys also go. In 1748, his mother dies, and he becomes the Earl of Ruglan, because she was a countess. So he's an Earl of March and Ruglan. He then has really a stroke of luck, as he would see it. In quick order, both sons die. And so, aged 40, or rather 50, he becomes the heir presumptive to the Duke of Queensberry, and he'll become the 4th Duke of Queensberry unless he dies. So that is a big step up. As the Earl of March and Ruglan, he was pretty much a popular, sought-after figure, not least by people who wanted to marry their daughters off to him, but now he's really hit the jackpot. This is Amesbury, a lovely house, now a convent, I believe, but that's where they lived and where he lived. But he obviously didn't like the country life. As soon as he could, he went to Edinburgh, and even more quickly, he came back to London when he was 21, where he immersed himself, here he is, in basically wine, women, and song, and we'll come on to those in turn. This is a portrait by Reynolds. So, gambling. Gambling was almost like a kind of disease in Georgian England, particularly London. Loo, a game, faro, hazard, a dice game, endless ways to lose and win money. And he immersed himself in it. In fact, there's some talk, because he's not yet the Duke, that he might even have made something of a living by being a professional gambler. And his secret in Georgian times was he didn't drink to excess, whereas everyone else did. Here's a quote from another historian. A statesman of the Georgian era was sailing on a sea of claret from one comfortable official haven to another. They drank all day. But if you want to gamble successfully, the thing to do is to stay a little bit sober so you don't get cheated and so you can keep your eyes on what's going on. The others lost fortunes, but he was always very circumspect. Even so, it's very surprising that this man, the young Charles James Fox, who went on to become the brilliant, infuriating, nearly man of British politics, his own father, once he left Eton, 15 or 16, sent him to London, and whose care do you think he was put under to show him the ropes, the ways of the world, to keep him on the straight and narrow, to give him inoculate him against all the pitfalls? None other than the Earl of March and Ruglan, Queensberry as was. It's a bit like in the 1970s taking your son out of, say, a convent school and placing him in the care of Oliver Reed and Keith Moon, or Lou Reed and William Burroughs. It's a strange thing to do. And fiction repeats this. It's Thackeray's The Virginians, 1847. There's a character in it actually called Lord March. And it says here, my Lord March has not, this is the character of the Virginian, the young ingenue being warned against him. My Lord March has not one but several devils. He loves gambling, he loves horse racing, he loves betting, he loves drinking, he loves eating, he loves money, he loves women. And you have fallen into bad company, Mr. Warrington. Indeed, immediately, the old March character bets this lad that his mother will not survive him, and he's laying 4 to 1 odds. Luckily, Mr. Warrington has got enough maternal respect not to take up the bet. So these guys obviously live in clubs, as we know. White's, this is White's. It started as a chocolate house, not a coffee house, run by an Italian called Bianchi, White, and it became White's. Clubs are important because with this gambling mania, if I bet someone in a low coffee house that, say, this bloke's just going to fall off his chair, and this before this one does, if I win the bet, the guy might scarper, not pay me. So clubs, the gambling is overt. People hear what you're doing, and it's registered in a book. And they were just obsessed. I mean, the craziness of these gambles were extraordinary. Here's just one. One of them, a member of White's, laid 500 guineas to 10 guineas, but none of the cabinet were beheaded within 3 years of that bet. And he won. Good on him. Another favourite of mine, Walpole, tells us this story, because he was a clubman. They're sitting around one day, and a guy has some sort of seizure in St. James's and is brought in. And they immediately bet how long he's going to last before he pops his clogs. And someone said, we must get a surgeon to... No, because that's going to destroy, that's upsetting the odds. You can't possibly do that. And another one, which involves Queensberry, Earl of March as he still is, he bets a man called Piggott that Piggott's father will die after someone called Codrington. Mr. Piggott Sr. will survive, outlast Codrington. And they bet 500 guineas on this, quite a sum. It turns out that Piggott Sr. has died that morning, which none of them know. So Mr. Piggott Jr. naturally says, well, the bet's off, because had he been a horse in a horse race, and he dies the day before the race, but all bets are scratched. March takes him to court and wins. So not only does he lose his poor old dad, he loses 500 guineas into the bargain. And that's just one of several just crazy stories. Also, people ruin themselves. £15,000 lost or won in an evening. Just quite astonishing. There we are. Women too gamble. That's the Duchess of Devonshire. That's the Prince of Wales, in fact. And she, by the end of her life, the Duke of Devonshire had to pay, so everyone said at the time, £1 million in Georgian money in gambling debts over a course of a long life of losing money hand over fist. £1 million. While we're talking about Georgiana, we're going to come on to the romantic side of Georgian life, but what was astonishing was how open they were about adultery, not just men who had mistresses, but women, once they'd had an heir and a spare, were quite openly having affairs. The Duke of Devonshire, the man who lost £1 million on his wife's bets, had 3 children by her and 2 by another lady, literally a lady. The Duchess had 1 by a Lord Grey, and they were all brought up together in Devonshire House with their correct name. So it was really quite open. Q, as he was known, or Old Q as he later became, we should say, never married. We'll come on to that. So he didn't have a mistress. But don't worry, he had other friends. What he was most famous for at the time is the turf. He was one of the fathers of the turf, Newmarket, which he really helped put on the map. Apparently he was very important in the development of horse racing, in the same way that his namesake was in pugilism. And again, is betting extraordinary sums of money, thousands of pounds on races, and he mostly stays afloat. Sometimes he loses, but he's got money to lose. Here we are again on the road to Newmarket. This is his house, or it was in 1920. He had a house for 40 years where he's overlooking the grounds, called, as you will guess, Queensberry House. Now, what he became very well known for was his 2 or 3 really crazy bets. Someone at White's bet him 1,000 guineas that he couldn't construct or come up with a construction for a carriage, a horse and carriage, with a passenger that could do 19 miles in an hour, which is at that point impossible. He spends months getting carriage makers in Longacre to design this ludicrous contraption, which is to a proper carriage as a futon is to a 4-poster bed, with this tiny little chap here as a passenger, specially trained racecourses. It probably cost him several thousand guineas to come up with this, but he wins the bet. And he was very, very famous for these sort of crazy bets. Another one he did, he was bet that a letter couldn't be delivered over a 50-mile distance in 1 hour. So, of course, what he does is he puts the letter in a cricket ball, gets 20 of the best fielders, and they throw it around, and they do it well within an hour. So he was very, very well known for these sort of capers. So, As I said, he was never married. He was constantly the target of caricatures, mostly when he was later. When he's older, we'll come on to that. Look, this is called quizzing a filly. He was also known as, later on, quiz, as in Queensberry quiz. So quizzing a filly, and you can see this is Gilray, a suggestive gesture on the part of our man there. And another one here, which looks very much like him as well. It's called a man of feeling, not entirely subtle. So he was certainly very, very up there in the marriage stakes. A lot of people would like their daughters to have married him because he was presumptive. Someone who knew him well at the time, Lady Louisa Stuart, the daughter of Lord Boots, so she certainly knew her aristocrats. He would have been held a great matrimonial prize as a duke's heir, could any young lady have had reasonable hopes of winning him. But prudent mammas, frightened, sought to keep their daughters aloof, and it was pretty plain that whoever dared the adventure must pursue it at her own peril. So, let's talk about Georgian sex life, which is, of course, very much overt compared to what came later in Victorian times. This is one of the most famous women in the mid-18th century. It's Kitty Fisher. This is painted by Reynolds. She's portrayed as Cleopatra dissolving a pearl. Reynolds painted, I think, 3 pictures of this lady, and she is famous only for being a courtesan. Now, whole gradations of relationships that involved either money or gifts at the time, and not uncommon in history. At the top, obviously, a royal mistress. We have one very nearby in Henrietta, Duchess of Suffolk. We have courtesans. So this is a courtesan, just simply famous for being a courtesan. She was well known, very, very well known, to charge 100 guineas for her client. 100 guineas, that is a lot of money, Georgian times. She was like a superstar. And she was very keen to get the money, but when the Duke of York came to visit her and left her a £50 note, she put it between 2 slices of bread and ate it for breakfast in front of him, just to show her contempt for being ripped off. She's possibly the person in the nursery rhyme. Lucy Lockett lost her pocket purse. Kitty Fisher found it. Not a penny was there in it, only ribbon round it. Well, she wasn't short of money, but she only lived 26 years. And that was not uncommon for all Georgians, but particularly for courtesans. So, again, the sheer sort of overtness of it is interesting. This is the 3rd Duke of Wharton, and this is his mistress, Fanny Parsons, who'd also been a prostitute, became a courtesan, became very celebrated, and these people were they were celebrated because they were very good company, very witty and intelligent. That was what was said of them, particularly Kitty Fisher, and also this lady. So this guy takes her to the opera when the king is there, and that was seen as just too far. These worlds weren't supposed to collide. It's a bit like in Goodfellas, where you have your girlfriend take out on a Friday night, your wife on a Saturday night. They weren't supposed to meet, so this was seen as really scandalous. Duke of Wharton in 1868 becomes Prime Minister. So she's, in a sense, the First Lady. So sometimes people went too far, but essentially a lot of things were just seen as fine. This is a very interesting fact. This is Reynolds, and this woman, another person who was a child prostitute. She was born into severe poverty and went on the streets and was suborned into prostitution by a notorious procuress, Emily Warren. She's painted here as Thais. Thais was the female companion of Alexander the Great, what was called an attirer, which was essentially a companion. It could have had a sexual relationship, but it didn't necessarily mean that, and we don't know whether she did or not. She was really a confidant. She persuaded him to burn Persepolis, so she was obviously someone he took seriously. So the idea was that some of these women, geishas, were the same, again without a sexual component, harems with one, but what was prized was very intelligent, just not simply girlfriends, but very, very interesting, witty people who you could really learn from. And a good example of that, Charles James Fox, we met earlier when Lord March put him on the, whatever the opposite of a straight and narrow is. His mistress, again, was someone who was sort of forced into prostitution as a girl, and they married secretly because of that. And at one point, he was lined up by, I think, his father or someone to marry a very rich heiress, and he refused to do it. She would, Elizabeth, Mrs. Armitage, as she was known, said that he told him he should do it because obviously he'd make money. And he wrote to her saying that he wouldn't do it. I love you more than life itself, indeed I do, and I cannot figure to myself any possible idea of happiness without you. I could not endure the thought of living with another woman. So, again, these are people who, the successful, lucky, clever, beautiful, and brainy ones, can rise out of this horrible morass, because for the common prostitutes, this is Tom King's cafe in Covent Garden, a notorious sort of brothel or a meeting house where you might go on to one having found someone. The life of most of the prostitutes in Georgian times, and apparently, according to a statistician at the time, by the end of the 18th century, 1 in 20 women in London, so he claimed, was involved in prostitution in one sort type or another. A lot of that obviously just meant part-time, but that's a horrifying statistic. How he could have worked that out, I don't know. But for most of them, life was nasty, brutish, and short. His Harlot's Progress, Hogarth, some country girl coming off the coach, probably thrown out by her family because she's a mouth too many to feed, a board or mole or mother taking her in a swim. Here another one, this is Rawlinson, launching a frigate. This is Portsmouth. It could equally be London. What happened for a lot of girls, they were called dress lodgers. And that's why often you hear of millineresses and seamstresses involved in prostitution as procuresses or boards, because they had access to fine clothing. And until the girl suborned into it, paid that debt off, she wouldn't get any money, and she was essentially a prisoner. So it was absolutely grim. And there's hundreds of reports of very well-dressed prostitutes hanging around, particularly Haymarket. So it was a really pretty grim time. And I think you just would agree that if a woman in a society is seen as a second-class citizen, then women will be treated badly sexually, and certainly that's the case here. And one of the, there we are, this is Rake's Progress. Again, this is some of the things that went on in these places is really demeaning and horrid. So let's move on. Here's the Duke again. Now, I'm afraid, having moved on, we're sort of back where we were, because he was notorious for his really as a sort of sex maniac, as we would have called him. His particular interest was in another sort of courtesan. Again, it's an unfortunate connection between the stage, whether it's acting, dancing, or singing, and people like this, who would take these ladies and basically have them as courtesans. This is Mademoiselle Parisot. She was hugely successful in the 1890s. She was not a courtesan, but her act didn't go down very well with the Bishop of Durham. Here he is, in one might assume is actually a caricature. It's not really. He wasn't really there. But look who's next to him, quizzing a filly of a horse of a different colour. It's our friend Queensberry. There it is. Look, there we are. It's quite clearly there. And blow me down, here he is again. It actually says, a peep at the Parisot with Q in the corner. So this is where he's already getting this reputation of being a dirty old man, because he's outlived all the young dirty men, and he's now seen as a sort of a bizarre anomaly, but he's still at it. He's still cutting a rug in the 70s and 80s. Theatre was a particular thing that he was involved in, and especially opera. He himself had a very good voice, apparently, and could accompany people on the harpsichord, and was often doing such a thing at soirees he threw himself in London or Richmond or other people's houses. But, again, unfortunately, it wasn't just goings on stage that were of interest to him. Look who's here. There he is again. Duke of Queensberry. So he was regarded as just an incorrigible individual. Now, we know he had 3 mistresses, because letters that survive, actually written to a local connection here, George Selwyn, who I'd love to talk about. We know something about his relationships. He had basically, I'll cut it short, he had 3 mistresses that we know about, and he was actually very. He wasn't rude about them. He was concerned, especially with his friend, if he was away, to look after them, make sure they had money, that they weren't being inconvenienced. He was very kind and quite solicitous to them. And yet, I mean, in these days, we don't know with him, but it wasn't uncommon for a courtesan to have a legal contract with her client. We don't know the situation here. Zamperini, as she was a top singer. She was very successful, and even better dancer. She was regarded as really a diva, a very, very successful person. And she was his 3rd mistress that we know about. He seems to have had several, 2 or 3 of these competing against each other. And I'm going to read just a couple of things from him, which I think give us an insight, and not a particularly good one, about his relationship. As I say, he wasn't in any way rude, or there's no sort of suggestion that he treated them unkindly, as other people in his position certainly did. So Zamperini, he writes, "She is the prettiest creature that ever was seen. In short, I like her vastly, and she likes me, because I give her money." He goes on, in another letter, "She's the prettiest creature in the world, but the most complete coquette that ever existed. It's her trade, and she knows it very well." Now, the next letter I read, and I thought I was quite inured to some of the grimmer side of Georgian life, is he asks Selwyn, who's, I think, in Paris, to buy her some different sort of clothing. Silk stockings of a very small size with embroidered clocks. And then he goes on, "She is but 15. Horrifying. Unfortunately, this looks like we might be leading into more pleasant pastures, but no, unfortunately not. This is the Duke of Queensberry. When he inherited the dukedom, he inherited this Drumlanrig castle in Dumfriesshire, which has been in the family for a very long time. He hardly ever went there. He went before the Duke had died, who was his second cousin, to sort of pay court, but he himself had no interest whatsoever. He was only interested in London and Piccadilly. So when he went there the first time after he'd become a duke, he basically had all the trees cut down for miles around and sold them as timber. And a local poet who was extremely angry about this was Robert Burns, who lived nearby in Dumfriesshire, and he wrote actually 3 hugely long poems complaining about this. I'll just give you one line from Verses on the Destruction of the Woods near Drumlanrig. I won't try and do it in the Burnsian Scots, don't worry. "The worm that gnawed my bonny trees, that reptile wears a ducal crown." Wordsworth, at the same time, just down the border, called him Degenerate Douglas, oh the unworthy lord. So he wasn't very popular in his native land. What he preferred was his London place, certainly. We'll come on to that, because that's where his real infamy was sort of put into legend, but although it was true. Here we are, Queensberry House, as it was by this stage. He took all the paintings from Amesbury, where he'd grown up, and moved them here after he'd become a duke, and he never went to Amesbury again. So everything was London, Piccadilly, and here. And it was apparently a super house. Walpole visits in 1786. He says, "The house is so handsome and the view so rich and the day was so fine that I could only have been more pleased if for half an hour I could have seen the real palace that once stood on that spot." So it was apparently a super place, very, very in demand. He would not just use it in the summer, would come down of an evening, leave Piccadilly at 5 o'clock in his carriages and come down and entertain. All sorts of rumours that all kinds of orgies were going on, who knows? Possible, we don't know. even though lots of people speculated after his death that they definitely happened, we don't know. So this is, as you say, a rather crude drawing of what they're still calling Cholmondeley House, although it's certainly by 1790, it's been for 10 years Queensberry House. If we look here, and we look here, because this is about 1805, you see there's a balcony. So he's put a balcony around the house, interestingly. One visitor is Wilberforce, who was something of a rake himself in his younger days, and he goes along and he says in his diaries, or recalls, the dinner was sumptuous, the views from the villa quite enchanting, and the Thames in all its glory. Now, who could disagree? If we were standing on Cholmondeley Walk, looking at the Thames in all its glory, Duke of Queensberry could disagree. He says to Wilberforce once he's complimented on his view, what is there to make so much of in the Thames? There it goes, flow, 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 always the same. He doesn't even credit it for flowing in two directions, so not a romantic. Clearly, inside the house is where he really came alive. This is the Great Hall, and you see it looks like a double height hall, very aristocratic thing. Talking of aristocrats, the Terror, 1793, this is where we see a good side of Queensberry. He entertains some of the impecunious aristocrats who were able to make their way from Paris or France into England, into London, some of whom have got their money with them in the form of jewels or whatever, and some who are completely boracic lint, as we would say. And he's very generous. He entertains them, hopefully in a decorous way, but he certainly is generous. He's a big supporter of the opera, as we said, and subscribed, which aristocrats often did. The opera didn't fall apart after the Beggar's Opera, as you often read. It went fairly strong. And he pretended to these French aristocrats that he had free tickets, essentially, to the opera because he was a subscriber. And he didn't. He paid for them. So he paid for them to go to the opera, but he did it in a way that they didn't think they were scrounging off him. So that shows the generous side of him. Talking of aristocrats, this is Madame du Barry, who was the mistress of Louis XV, who died in 1777, I believe, 1774. She, once the revolution happened, she managed to take a lot of her jewels to London. I think some were stolen, others she pretended were stolen, a fake robbery. She took he'd given her masses and masses of jewels. She took them to London and partly was there looking after them, but she kept coming back and forward. She came from France to London 4 times, which was foolhardy because at one point her own servant accused her of having worked to try and keep aristocrats alive, giving them escape routes, helping them financially, and basically being anti-revolutionary. Now, whether that was true or not, she was executed at age 50 in 1793. Well, saving aristocrats from France, we think immediately of Baroness Orczy Scarlet Pimpernel, admittedly written in 1903. In the descriptions of her novel, I won't read them to you, but it's quite clear that she's basing Sir Percy Blakeney's house on the Queensberry House in Richmond. It's by the river, the descriptions mostly fit. And we know for a fact that Madame du Barry was in Queensberry House. It's not Anne Hathaway slept here, because Walpole in his diary mentions talking to her in 1791. Other regular visitors, as the plaque outside the Queensberry House says, were the Prince of Wales, later the Regent, later George IV, and his secret wife, Mrs. Fitzherbert. They'd married in 1785 because she was a Catholic, so his father didn't recognize it as a legitimate marriage. They were often entertained at Queensberry House, again, hopefully decorously. But then Queensberry makes his big mistake. He bets on the wrong horse. 1788, first episode of madness of George III. This is, I think, Crookshank. I've got it on my list somewhere, but it's it's the only cartoon character that survived from this thing. That's supposed to be the Duke. That's supposed to be the Prince of Wales. Damn me, come along. I'll see if the old fellow's dead or not, is what he's supposed to be saying. Well, Queensberry tries to find the same thing out. He's a gambling man. He goes to, presumably, Kew Palace or Kew House, where the medical people are, and he ascertains that from their point of view, George isn't going to recover. So then there's a big political squabble. Prince of Wales wants to become regent with quite a lot of political power. Pitt, on the other hand, doesn't want that to happen, because he will then be severely out of power himself or disconvenient. So there's a big fight, and, as we know, George recovers. Now, in 1760, when it became George III, he'd appointed Queensberry as one of the lords of the bedchamber, a completely ceremonial role. And he's understandably, very cross that Queensberry's thrown his hat in the ring with the Prince of Wales. And so that's the end of his political career. So he definitely backed the wrong horse. There we are. That's another caricature. Again, one of these people is Queensberry. There he is, backing the wrong horse, backing the wrong stag in this case. But then there's other issues that he gets involved in where, again, he loses. Up to this point, up to the middle of the 18th century, Cholmondeley Walk was the only part of the Thames around here that was accessible. Then in 1744, George III made the towpath from Kew Gardens all the way around to Old Palace Lane, Cholmondeley Walk, a towpath. 1777, when the bridge was going to be built, there was an act of Parliament making that part of the river also accessible, much to the great annoyance of the landowners. So the whole of that part was now free to walk along, as it is today. But then, one of his biographers says in 1830, notwithstanding the considerable charities which the Duke dispensed at Richmond and the sums which his magnificent mode of living circulated in the neighbourhood, a trickle-down theory, 18th century style, the inhabitants were ill-advised enough to instituting against him a vexatious suit at law for the recovery of a few yards of ground, which, unconscious of any invasion of parochial rights, he had taken into his enclosure. What could this footling bit of a few yards of ground be? Well, it's this one. He basically tried to enclose Cholmondeley Walk. So, this does not go down well with the local council. This is the 12th of October 1805. It having been moved and seconded that a copy of the minutes respecting the alterations intended to be made in Cholmondeley Walk by the Duke of Queensberry to be transmitted to his grace, ordered that the clerk do make a copy of the same for him accordingly. It goes to court. And on January 1807, at this meeting, which Whitshed Keene Esquire, and he is the owner now of Askill House, so had he lost this, his access to the river would have gone, as would have everyone else in Richmond, presented the deed of covenant and agreement between His Grace the Duke of Queensberry and Mr. John Andrews and certain inhabitants of this parish, dated 19th of November 1806, ordered that the same be deposited in the parish chart and that an extract be made there from us to what is incumbent on the Duke to do. Incumbent on the Duke to do. That didn't go down well at all. The historian continues, conscious how great a benefactor he'd been to the place, the Duke quitted Richmond in disgust, and hereafter his vices and vast expenditure solely to the metropolis. So he leaves. And yet, here's the famous Turner painting. We still have that. And there it is today, just to prove it. So here's really when he enters his notoriety. This book was written in 1808. Rumours of his rumoured to have died, they were exaggerated because he didn't die until 1810. The Piccadilly Ambulator, or Old Q, containing memoirs of the private life of that evergreen votary of Venus, throughout which were interspersed anecdotes of the most noted fashionables, his contemporaries. And it goes on, the coronet, which gives and receives splendour, when fixed on the brow of merit, glitters on the worthless head, like a mark of disgrace, to render vice, folly, and inhumanity conspicuous. And what follows is about 80 pages of complete tosh, mostly celebrating what they're also clucking about, how dreadful he is. But, let's face it, it was pretty dreadful. This is his townhouse now. It's now his house is now two houses, 138 and 139 Piccadilly. That one would have been Byron's a bit later on. Here it is, right on the corner of Park Lane, as it now is. It used to be Tyburn Lane, but Park Lane. So there's Green Park, there's Hyde Park. So all the fashionable people, sort of promenades, he was there. Right, where was it? There. That's his house there. Now, what we do know, why am I showing you a Rubens painting? We do know that amongst the many things he got up to in his house, and rumours of what they could have been, here's one here. It says, this is a historian, his house in Piccadilly and his villa at Richmond became the easy and favourite resorts of the superannuated libertine, and here are enacted those frequent scenes of splendid vice, of almost oriental voluptuousness, and indeed of deliberate sensuality, of which delicacy precludes a detail. Quite right. One thing we do know is he enacted the Judgment of Paris. King Paris of Troy is asked to give a golden apple to the fairest of Aphrodite, Hera, and Athena. It's a trick, Paris, it's a trick. And of course the Trojan War follows. So he basically, Queensberry gets three of the most beautiful women in London, who presumably have to do the Rubens and disrobe, and awards them the Gilded Apple. So as someone else said, he was quite a boy, and he confined himself really to the life of the clubs. This is the Union Club, celebrating the Union of Ireland. He says he confined himself almost entirely in the decline of his life to the society of the clubs and to the voluptuous and enervating pleasures which are alone to be obtained in a great city. Here he is, yet again, same guy. I mean, Gilray could have almost had him as a Photoshop. Boom! I mean, he's just everywhere. This, I think, is Rawlinson. It's called, the Aged Debauchee, or something similar. So here he is walking out with some young lady. And here's another one. Now, this just sums up really what I'm going to show you next, is how he was now felt. And it's really the A word. It's the fact that he's so old. Most of his contemporaries are dead, drunk themselves to death. He's still at it. And as with satires, which in early Greek myth have goatish characteristics, Susanna and the Elders, Pantalone in Commedia dell'arte, and the female side, distaff side, wife of Bath, there's this idea that what you might do in your 20s, 30s, and 40s, you shouldn't really be doing at his age. The old quiz, the old goat of Piccadilly, it says that particular one by a caricaturist called Dighton, a shining star in the British period and a useful ornament to society, fudge. So obviously, he's just seen now as a figure of pity and contempt, not in any way admired for being a sort of Lothario. This one here, someone's got his number here, he's saying, "Oh, you beauty, you little mountain daisy, I'll take care of you, don't be afraid, you shall ride my little horse, and I'll walk by the side of you. You'll be the Queen of Piccadilly." And she says, "I thank your honour. I heard as how you was in town, and had a great many places to give away, so I thought it best to come to the Fountainhead at once." So she obviously knows who he is, and she's come to try and pick him up, not the other way round. So here he is, as a historian says, still wallowing in wealth, still rolling in wealth, wallowing in sin. What he would do, he'd sit when he became too old to walk around himself, he'd sit in his balcony, and he had a servant who he would send down had a pony ready. Anyone he saw walking outside his house in Piccadilly, and he would get the servant to proposition this person, to try and bring them up to see if they wanted to see his etchings. So this again made him just people just thought this was ludicrous. Here's another of him doing it. See, there we are. It was said by a later biographer, maybe he was also just asking friends to come up, but no. In all the contemporary accounts, it's young women that he takes a fancy to. Sort of Mayfair's Got Talent sort of thing. There he is, with a parasol in the summer, the old rogue. But, as a friend of his said, and it is a fact that when he lay dying in December 1810, his bed was covered with BAs and letters to the number of at least 70, mostly indeed addressed to him by females of every description and of every rank, from duchesses down to ladies of the easiest virtue. He had an illegitimate daughter, Mimi, a very interesting person. He left her and her husband, this is the Earl of Yarmouth, who later on becomes the third Marquis of Hertford, and is, if you've read Vanity Fair, is the horrible Lord Stein, or Steen. So pretty just makes Q look like a Mother Teresa. They inherited the house, but they left it to rack and ruin. They moved. I think she went to Paris in about 1802, and he went to live a sybaritic life in London. So it fell apart, literally. Interestingly, this, as I mentioned, is by Reynolds. This is in the Wallace collection. Why? Because the Earl of Yarmouth became the Marquis of Hertford. His son collected hugely important paintings, Dance to the Music of Time, Laughing Cavalier, and many others. And he left them to his illegitimate son, who's founded the Wallace Collection in what's still Hertford House in Manchester Square. It used to be Manchester House. And here's one I'll just sum up just for, this is the Swing, as you know, Fragonard, part of the collection. And it just says a lot about this, the Georgian society, sort of surface patina of elegance, restraint, sort of Augustan sort of balance. And yet, look, he's doing exactly what Q was doing in all of those paintings. So it really, it's a very strange but it's fascinating society. Queensberry House, built in 1830, lots of MPs lived there. We see now that it's back from the river. That's where the original was. Here it's back to the river. It goes for sale in 1933. There are no buyers. No one wants to buy it. The people of Richmond writing letters to the Times saying it's got to be bought. Why doesn't Richmond Council buy it and turn it into a museum and art gallery, gardens? They decide they can't afford it. Now, the problem is that it's then bought by a builder, and his plans originally are to build right up to what's now the river path. So the houses or flats would be right there where the trees are. So this was basically forbidden. Oh, we'll go back a bit. And what happened was he was allowed to build not 20 houses, which was his original plan, but 48 flats and then 16 garages, which is what more or less is the case now. And in fact, the flats were lower in height than the Queensberry House originally. And as one of the councillors said, the original Queensberry House is one of the ugliest early Victorian houses you can see. Whereas a councillor Maycock said of the current flats when he saw the design, he called them a glorified block of almshouses. So take your pick. Thank you, Councillor Maycock. So that is essentially the story. What's left? This was Queensberry built a covered archway so his guests wouldn't get wet when they dropped off at Friars Lane. The opposite of this entrance is what the car park is now in Friars Lane. That was his stables. So he dropped off there. This is actually from later, 1833. That was a pump house for a water supply for the second Queensberry House. But there's another view of it with this, I think a later edition, and some sort of friezes. I think they're concrete. There they are. This fountain was from early 1930s. That's still there. So, thank you, old Q, and thank you very much for listening to my speech. Thank you.
Wow. How about that? That was absolutely fascinating. The research you've done for this is terrific. All the maps and the pictures.
Oh, well, that was fun. That was the fun bit.
Where did you find all of that material?
A lot of it is online, but it's not in many of the books. The last book written about him was 1927. No, it was one in 67, but he was forgotten about. So, so I just kept finding just dozens of characters.
Sounds like you've had a lot of fun doing it.
Oh yeah.
Right, can we have some questions then? Who would like to ask a question? We've got Mike, roving Mike. Julian's got one, and Simon's got one. Who would like to ask a question? Yes.
You didn't say anything about his death. Do you know anything about his death?
Could you maybe just wait for the so people can hear? Sorry.
You didn't say anything about his death. Do we know anything about that? Was it prolonged?
He
must have been pretty ill, and with all those women, one assumes he had a good old dose of syphilis there, I imagine. But none of that seemed to have come out, and he did live to a great age, didn't he, or reasonable age?
85, which is an extremely good age. He was said to have died of a surfeit of fruit. And I don't think that's a metaphor. And his mother, or no, not his mother, his Kitty, Kitty Hyde, his sort of guardian mother, she was supposed to have died of, I think, cherries. So there was obviously fruit was a very dangerous thing in those days. But no, he sort of died of old age. I mean, amazing he carried on, given the longevity of the time, you know. So a life of sin obviously did him well, yeah.
Any other questions? Yes.
Was he always on his own? He wasn't part of a sort of circle of roués. He was just his own.
Oh, no, he certainly was. He was, he was a very clubbable person. He knew everybody, and so he was. Yeah, Newmarket, of course, they were together. So he lived it up with them, you know, gambling and so on. One good thing, I wish I'd had time to get into, is that he seems to have refused to get involved in the Hellfire Club, even though he could have done. So he seems to have been less objectionable than, say, Lord Sandwich, who was a horrid man, who was really unpleasant to his, you know, the lower class women that he picked up and abused. So he was deeply unpleasant at that level. But no, I think he certainly was, but there's no suggestion, well, apart from that book of a Piccadilly ambulator, there's just, and then later one written after he died, just full of complete nonsense, you know. So none of it can be proved, and it sounds unlikely. So I think he just, you know, he was very social. He spent a lot of time in clubs. And was very, you know, he knew everyone, and every night he'd be at dinner with someone or a ball. So he was social, and he was, you know, he had lots of women friends, I should have pointed out. I don't think he was part of a sort of horrible circle like the Dashwood people.
Did he have, you said he was involved in the sort of start of the turf.
Yes.
This is the sort of start of thoroughbreds racing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Did he own any famous horses, or was he just a gambler, not an actual...
No. He owned and ran horses, I think, for at least 40 years, if not more. Yeah, he was really, really keen. And if I'd had time, I would have said more, not what I know about the turf, but he actually rode himself in races a couple of times, but only against other aristocrats. Otherwise, it would have been, like, you know, unfair. Like he might be being paid to do it. Yes. So, no, he was apparently, by all accounts, a very, very good... He was a very accomplished man. Had he died at 60, he wouldn't have been that... You know, he wouldn't have been... This wouldn't have been the case. It's just that he's sort of been kind of from the 1810s onwards, they start to get to beginnings of a sort of a revision of ideas, and so he just outlived his time, really. Everyone had done what he did, but he did it at the time when people were starting to say, we can't continue like this.
And did he have something to leave to the next generation? So he didn't squander his entire fortune?
No, he had £1 million in Georgian money, and he left it to the whole series of legacies, the whole series, very generous, you know, servants, all sorts of people, but most of it went to his illegitimate daughter. So in a sense, we have him to thank in part for the marvellous Wallace collection. And if you go there, I would personally suggest that the most outstanding stuff is what his ancestor, his descendant bought in Paris, the second Earl of Hertford.
Right.
So it's but his legacy was really just that Gilray could probably have starved without his constant able to take the mickey out of a old quiz.
Great. Judy, are there any Zoom? How many people on the Zoom have we got? 30, very good, great. So any other questions? If you do have a question for David, he will be happy to answer them afterwards, or downstairs if you're coming for a drink, which I hope you will do, for a conversation, chats and so on. So thanks very much, everybody. Just one final thing, the most important thing, is a thank you from the Society.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
And please thank everybody.
Yes, well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Next event in November. Thank you.